From New York Times Opinion, I'm Lulu Garcia-Navarro, and this is First Person, a show where we talk to people about how they come to their opinions and what it means to live with them. The message on climate change has been pretty consistent for the last few decades. We need to act now, and if we don't, very bad things will happen. It's a message that's been communicated in dry scientific reports and also in much splashier ways, like the recent protests involving activists throwing soup at works of art. Those kinds of actions are often criticized for alienating as many people as they inspire. But then again, they do get people's attention. That's something that Steven Guilbeault knows well. Guilbeault was involved in extreme climate protests when he was working for Greenpeace 20 years ago. A Canadian newspaper even gave him the nickname Green Jesus. Now Guilbeault is Canada's Climate and Environment Minister. And while he hasn't changed the message, he has shifted tactics, joining those he used to protest against. And with that, he's angered his former allies. Today on First Person, Minister Steven Guilbeault, savior or sellout? All right.
Should I address you as Lulu?
Lulu.
Yeah?
Yes,
okay.
Please.
Okay.
I will not be addressing you by your first name because that feels a little bit informal considering your position. So I'll call you Minister if that's okay.
That's fine.
Okay. Tell me about the first time you were arrested.
1997, I'd just started working at Greenpeace. Maybe, I don't think I was a month in the job. And there's a coal plant very close to Toronto. And we had targeted it to try and raise awareness about climate change and environmental impacts. So we decided to block the entrance of a big coal tower where the coal station was resupplied by ships that traveled through the Great Lakes. And I basically ascended at the opening of that coal tower to prevent the ship from unloading its coal into it.
That was your first arrest, but certainly not your last. How many times have you been arrested?
I've been arrested 4 times.
And your most high-profile arrest came in 2001 after you climbed the CN Tower, which at the time was, I believe, the tallest structure in the world. It was in Toronto. You unfurled a banner that said, "Canada and Bush, climate killers."
Toronto News tonight, reaching for the clouds to send a message about global warming.
We're here today to say to the government, choose Kyoto, not Bush.
Tell me about that protest.
One of the things we were trying to do at the time, we were trying to get the Kyoto Protocol into force. And Canada was resisting ratifying it. The United States was resisting ratifying it.
The idea of placing caps on CO2 does not make economic sense for America.
It was an important milestone internationally in the fight against climate change. So we wanted to find a way to attract attention of Canadians to this. And someone in the team came up with this idea of climbing, scaling the CN Tower and unfolding this banner. So we decided to go for it.
Can you bring me to the top of that tower with you? You were dressed in an orange jumpsuit. You were dangling more than 1,000 feet in the air on the side of this skyscraper.
So I'm not a professional climber, but I climb, and obviously we trained before doing that because it took 4 hours of nonstop climbing to get to the top. And we started climbing around 4 o'clock in the morning. And as we were climbing, I saw the sunrise on Lake Ontario. I have a very vivid memory of that moment. It was quite beautiful. It was a bit extenuating. It wasn't easy climbing all the way there.
No, it doesn't sound it.
And I actually got motion sickness.
Oh,
because we were climbing on steel cables that were installed so that workers using hydraulic platforms, which we were not using, we were using our own body to climb. And my cable was very loose. So it wasn't too bad at the beginning, and it was okay when we were towards the top. But in the middle, because of the wind, I'd swing like, 10 feet back and forth. And I started feeling as if I was on a ship, like motion sickness. So because of that, I didn't eat that day because if you eat and you have motion sickness, what can happen is unpleasant. And
the people below you, for sure.
Yes, that was not the picture we were looking for.
From the start, this was a carefully orchestrated media stunt. Police officers told them the climbers would be arrested when they got down, but they had no intention of going up and arresting them.
During the day, it started raining at one point, and lightning storms started coming on Lake Ontario. So you have two guys 1,300 feet in the air dangling from steel cables. What could go wrong? So we had to come down a bit faster than anticipated.
When heavy rain hit, the fire department met the climbers halfway. The two men were taken down and arrested.
And just to step back, what was the philosophy behind the protest? I mean, why were you willing, you personally, to go to extremes for your cause?
Well, Greenpeace has a long tradition of nonviolent civil disobedience, inspired by what was done by Gandhi in India and Martin Luther King in the US, to use your body to protest an injustice, to try and draw attention to a situation you feel you're morally obliged to act upon. I felt at the time, and I still feel, that climate change is one of the, if not the greatest threat to humanity. And I felt that not enough people were paying attention to it at the time, and certainly governments weren't paying enough attention at the time.
And so you felt that you're putting your body at risk was a small price to pay?
Oh, absolutely.
And what about the people close to you, your family? Did they understand at the time what you were fighting for?
Some did. Many in my family saw me at the time as a bit eccentric, a bit. I mean, they loved me, and they still do. But I'm not sure.
They got why you were dangling off a cable off the tallest structure in the world?
No, I don't think most of them didn't. They certainly saw my determination and my passion, but I'm not sure they understood why I was doing it.
Do you think at that point, activists like yourself were the most effective messengers for the climate movement? Did it get through to people what you were doing?
I mean, clearly, climbing the CN Tower got people talking about climate change, and the Kyoto Protocol, and it became a political issue in Canada. Now, am I saying that because we climbed the CN Tower, Canada ratified, or solely because we climbed the CN Tower in 2001, and that 2 years later Canada ratified the Kyoto Protocol? Of course not. Did the fact that people like myself and others used various tactics to bring attention of decision makers, of the public, of the media to this issue, that I think all those things put together contributed to Canada eventually ratifying the Kyoto Protocol. So I think it is an effective form of activism, and certainly one that has been used by Greenpeace and other social movements over time to draw attention to issues.
You left Greenpeace in 2007 to work for an environmental group you'd helped start years earlier, Equiterre. Why?
I felt that I had and continue to have lots of respect for Greenpeace and from what they do. But I felt that for me, it was time to move on, to continue my activism in a different way.
I guess before, your activism was based on getting people invested in climate change so that would put pressure on government. How did that change in this new role?
It's interesting because I saw my role when I was at Greenpeace as being the more hardcore activist in the group, but working with people who weren't perceived as being as such, but who would do more of the insider work that I believe is needed to be able to change things in our society. That was me, the insider now. I basically became an environmental lobbyist. And that's what I did. Working on bills, working on regulations, working on budget spending, doing things that I wasn't doing when I was at Greenpeace.
At the time, the government in Canada was led by Stephen Harper. He was a conservative who was not known for his environmental bona fides. I assume you didn't have a very receptive audience in the government during that time?
Not at all. Not only did we have a government that wasn't inclined to act on environmental issues, but it was actively engaged in being in opposition to what the environmental movement and many municipalities and companies and provinces in Canada were proposing. Like we were deemed enemy of the state back then by this government.
I'm curious about the sort of broader idea of being in opposition to the Harper government. I mean, it's clear you had something to fight against, which seems like a natural extension of your previous activism. Did it feel like a familiar position?
It's a fascinating question, Lulu, because when you look at the history of the environmental movement, it was really created around being in opposition to something, to companies dumping toxic waters in our rivers and streams and lakes, to nuclear testing. And I think as our society changes, the environmental movement also is changing, so that now we have organizations that are more solutions oriented and not so much in opposition to things, but there are still things we should be opposed to. So I think my career choices have been in some ways influenced by some of the changes we are seeing or in the environmental movement.
So when Justin Trudeau was elected in 2015, activists are pretty inherently skeptical of politicians and their promises. And you were.
Last time we spoke, Prime Minister Trudeau encouraged me to speak my mind and push hard whenever I felt we might collectively err. Let's talk pipeline then.
The year after he was elected at the Liberal convention, you gave a speech where you were directly addressing Trudeau, calling out his support for increasing oil production through pipeline projects.
Prime Minister, large pipeline projects have failed to gain social license from all across the continent. And with the world working around the clock to avoid the worst effect of climate change, it makes no sense from an ethical and a moral perspective to produce and ship more of a substance that is causing a problem that disrupts the future of our children and grandchildren.
But you had a change of heart because Trudeau tapped you to be his climate minister after his re-election in 2021, and you agreed. Can you talk to me about that?
I knew a lot of people who decided to either run for office or when the Trudeau government was elected, decided to leave the environmental movement and go and work for members of parliament, for ministers. So they were interesting times because all of a sudden we had access like we'd never had before. But in my line of work, one should never confuse access with influence.
Good distinction.
Yeah, because you can have access and no influence, or access with the illusion of influence. But I could see that we were starting to have influence as well. So I'd seen the Trudeau government in action for over 4 years. By then, they had done things I had publicly disagreed with, like purchasing a pipeline. And the Prime Minister asked me if I would run in the 2019 election. I must say, it took me a long time to decide. It took me probably 9 months between the first time I was asked and when I decided to go for it. And there's a couple of reasons I decided to do it. I felt that they had started doing good things, but that there's still a lot of work that needed to be done. I felt that the potential was there to do more and to do it faster. And I was very concerned with the fact that the Conservative Party could return as the national government, and that those gains we had started to see could be compromised. So between all these things, I decided to run in 2019 and was elected for the first time. I was Heritage Minister for 2 years, and then after the 2021 election, the Prime Minister asked me to serve as Environment and Climate Change Minister.
Given your disagreements, why do you think he chose you?
I think the best way to answer this question is to tell you about when I was with the Prime Minister in the COP26 in Glasgow last year, so the United Nations climate change meeting in the UK. And the Prime Minister asked me to be with him in a small group meeting. There was about 40 of us. Prime Minister Modi from India was there, Angela Merkel, Boris Johnson, and President Biden was there. And then he was leaving. The Prime Minister turns to me and he says, "Stephen, have you ever met President Biden?" Of course, I've never met President Biden. So the Prime Minister grabs me. And as your president is about to leave the room with just 10 bodyguards and everything, my Prime Minister just grabs him by the shoulder and he says, "Joe, let me introduce you to my new environment minister. He's a real activist. He was arrested 4 times for his climate change activism." and the president looked at us smiling and said, "Oh my goodness, I can't be seen with criminals." And we then had a very pleasant conversation.
I want to slow down this story with you meeting President Biden for the first time, because we've been talking about the various stages of your life, but now you're finally in the room where it happens. You're with the most powerful person in the world who can have an impact on climate change. Did it feel significant? To use your own words, did you have access but no influence?
Well, I see my role, and I think certainly the Prime Minister of Canada sees my role as being an activist inside government, as opposed to what I used to do, being an activist outside government. So in some ways, the work I do hasn't changed so much. I push and push and push every day so that Canada can go faster in reducing our dependencies to fossil fuels. And it's no small feat. I mean, Canada is the 4th largest oil and gas producer in the world. So, it's a challenge for everyone to transform our societies and our economies. But for a country like us, who's for decades, we've depended on the revenues and our society has been very influenced by the oil and gas sector, I'd say it's even more challenging.
As you say, you're working for a government that does push oil and gas. And I can hear your younger self asking, does your presence in that room with President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau give them both the ability to look as if they are, in fact, more radical on climate than they are because of your own history?
So some in the environmental movement have applauded my decision to try and go and change things from the inside. Then there are those in the environmental movement who feel that it's a betrayal of everything I stood for and what I believed in. Frankly, I again, for the same reasons, I left Greenpeace to go to Iquital, because I felt it was time for me to try and continue my activism, but in a different way. The decision to leave the environmental movement and go into politics is, for me, a continuation of my life's work. It's not breaking with anything. It's not a rupture. It's really a continuation.
Has it been painful to be rejected by the people that you used to belong to?
Let me put it this way. I haven't lost any friends that I had before joining politics. I've strained some friendships at times. But I think all of the people who were close to me before understand what I'm trying to do. They may not, they do not agree with all of our government's decisions, for sure. I don't necessarily personally agree with all of our government's decisions. But that's probably the most challenging thing, going from the outside to the inside. Before, I used to represent a group of people. Équiterre had, 250,000 members and sympathizers. And those people were all in agreement. That's why they were members or sympathizers of the organization. And when you're on the outside, you never have to make any decisions. You never have to assume the consequences of those decisions, because you're not in government. You don't make decisions. You propose, you make recommendations, you apply pressure. Now I'm the Minister of Environment and Climate Change for 38 million Canadians who don't have the same views on these things, who don't have the same interests on these things. And we, as a government, have to try and find ways to navigate those differences.
After the break, Minister Guilbeault navigates those differences by approving an oil project.
You're a climate criminal, Mr. Guilbeault. You're a climate criminal. History, that's how history will understand you.
You're the Environment and Climate Change Minister for, like you cited, the world's fourth largest oil-producing nation. You've been talking about some of the compromises that being in that position has forced you to make. What has been your hardest decision yet as Environment Minister?
By far, I had to approve a decision to allow permits, federal permits, for an offshore oil platform off our east coast, the Baie du Nord project. Now, it's going to be one of the lowest greenhouse gas emitting oil in the world. As a government, we've imposed a number of conditions on the company. It'll have to be carbon neutral by 2050, and it'll have to demonstrate between now and then how it's making efforts to achieve carbon neutrality. I could tell you all of these things, and these things are true. But I think it's not just me who felt that this was a difficult decision, even within my government.
Did you feel like signing off on that project was a betrayal of your roots?
It was a very difficult decision. I don't think, I never, even before coming into government, I've always thought you can't judge the action of a government based on one single project. So I hope that people won't judge me by this decision on Baie du Nord, and that they will look at everything I did before making a conclusion about my tenure as Environment Minister.
You've discussed how your former activist colleagues haven't been happy with your decision-making in certain situations. And a lot of climate activists would say there's no acceptable compromise on things like this because the stakes are so high. Do you think it's time for climate activists to start compromising?
So the day I announced that project, the Baie du Nord project, many in the environmental movement in Canada, not just in Canada, were very, very critical of that decision. And some said so in a very public way. And I came home that night here in Ottawa, and I was not feeling particularly good. And around 8:00 that night, I started getting messages from some of my ex-colleagues who said, listen, we're not happy with that decision, but Stephen, you're still our favorite environment minister.
Is that damning with faint praise, or did they mean it?
No, I think they still talk to me, and they still engaged. So I mean, we all make compromise. Living in society is about making compromise. We do them every day. We do them in our family. I'm a father of 4. I can tell you that I have to make compromises at home all the time it's a bit of an illusion to think that on a scale of millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people, we could not compromise about things. But I do agree with those who say that we need to make transformational changes. And we're seeing some of it, but we're not seeing enough of it right now. But for us to be able to go as fast as we would need to go, we need to have a population that understands why we're doing this and why the pace of change in the decisions that we're making and in the world that they've known for decades is changing so rapidly. And we're seeing resistance to that. There was the Gilets jaunes in France when they hiked up a gas tax, a carbon gas tax.
The yellow vests.
In France, the yellow vest in France. And so it's a tricky business for governments. You can't be so far ahead of where your population is that they have no idea what you're talking about. So we have to find ways of getting them on board with them. And I don't think collectively we're doing a very good job at this right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's been 25 years since the Kyoto Protocol was adopted, and global emissions continue to increase. Countries around the world are failing to live up to their climate commitments. Canada has never met its targets. You've got 4 kids, so clearly, though, you don't think we're all doomed. Am I right?
That's a safe assumption, yes. But I would consider myself a realistic optimist. I mean, we've entered the era of climate change. A third of Pakistan is underwater now. That's millions of people that are homeless now because of floodings. It's going to take decades to reverse the trend that we've started collectively over decades and decades of negligence. I mean, 50 years ago, we could claim that we didn't know, but we've known for 30 years. Like the scientific reports we get today are more detailed or more granular in their analysis, but we knew most of what we know now in terms of climate change in the early or mid-90s. At the first conference of parties in Berlin in 1995, where I was with a group of young activists from all over the world. And I might have been seen blockading the doors of the conference hall where the meeting was taking place, telling the delegates, you haven't done your job. You can't leave. You can't go back home. It's not finished. I think if governments had listened, then we'd be in a very different world now, but they didn't.
Minister, you began your career scaling towers. How do you understand the climate protests happening now? Like activists throwing mashed potatoes at a Monet, others that flung tomato soup at works of art.
I mean, I think activism is essential and is important. And I often, not that they need reminding, but I tell my ex-colleague that it's not a bad thing that they keep my feet to the fire, that they keep the pressure on. It's important. Honestly, I don't think we need to choose between culture, arts, and fighting climate change. I don't think it's a choice between those things. But overall, I think activism and protest are essential.
So that's my question, big picture. What is the best way to move the needle forward? You've been a shock artist. You're now a minister. You have a perspective that no one else really has. What works?
We need to really transform the way we communicate on this. We haven't, and we still, by and large, not doing a very good job communicating on climate change. My stepdad worked in a pulp and paper mill all his life in my small town of Letchuk in northern Quebec. And most of the things we talk about, like, he doesn't get. He sees some changes, but he drives a pickup truck everywhere, and it's not. He's very representative of many, if not most, Canadians and Americans. How can we communicate based on his values and the things he cares about, as opposed to communicating about the things I care about? And I think that's what we need to do. And a friend told me some time ago, he said, Stephen, you guys need to learn to sell the beach. And what he meant by that is, you look at advertisement from travel agencies and airlines, and they sell you those packages to go on the beach. But people don't, when they buy the beach, they don't think about, the security checks at airports and the long lineups and your luggage ended up in Europe when you're going to Cancun. And no, they sell the beach, and that's what people buy. And I think collectively we need to do a better job at showcasing what it is we're trying to do, like beyond moving from oil to electrification or clean technologies. Like what kind of world, what kind of communities are we trying to create? And I think the more we can do that, the more people will be able to relate to what we're trying to do.
You just said that your friend said you need to learn to sell the beach, which is the opposite of what a lot of climate messaging has been, obviously.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
A lot of the climate message has been one that's sort of devoid of hope. It's about scaring people into action.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not working. It's clear. And I'm as guilty as anyone out there. Like I've done this because we thought that's what we needed to do to get people and media and government to pay attention. And in a way, it worked. Like more and more people are paying attention. But you're right. They think that it's hopeless, and it's not. But if they think it's hopeless, then they won't act. Why bother?
You said earlier that the environment movement was created in opposition. Do you think it can evolve beyond that?
I think it has evolved quite a bit as a movement. But, Lulu, it is, for people in general, it's easier to say no than to say yes. Because saying no is easy. You don't want something. Everyone talks about electrification of transportation. Okay, I'm all for it. I don't own a vehicle. I've never owned a vehicle. I'll never own a vehicle. But my ministerial vehicle is an electric vehicle. But people have to realize that if we want to electrify our transportation system, we'll need mining. Now, you ask people, are you in favor of mining? Are you asking environmentalists? You're in favor of electrification. Are you in favor of mining? They go, well, listen, it's a bit complicated. Well, it's not. So these are some of the challenges that the movement hasn't really grappled with a lot yet. But, they'll evolve. They'll get there. I'm not worried for them.
Listening to you talk, it seems that you certainly have evolved from that man dangling from a very long cable at the top of the CN Tower. Have you not?
I mean, I'm still as passionate and determined and sometimes outraged at what I'm seeing and what I feel needs to change than I was 21 years ago when I climbed the CN Tower. But I mean, I've evolved in perhaps better understanding that changing things on the scale of a society like mine is more complicated perhaps than I thought 20 years ago, for sure. And I'm confronted by this every day as a minister. So I suppose, yes, from that perspective, yes, I have evolved.
Minister, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lou. It was a fascinating conversation and a difficult one at times. In a good way, in a good way.
First Person is a production of New York Times Opinion. This episode was produced by Courtney Stein and Sofia Alvarez-Boyd. It was edited by Stephanie Joyce and Kari Pitkin. Mixing by Carol Saburo and Isaac Jones. Original music by Isaac Jones, Carol Saburo, Sonia Herrero, and Pat McCusker. Fact-checking by Mary Marge Locker, Michelle Harris, and Kate Sinclair. The rest of the First Person team includes Annabelle Bacon, Olivia Natt, Wyatt Orm, and Jillian Weinberger. Special thanks to Christina Samuelewski, Shannon Busta, Raymond Zhuang, Allison Benedict, and Katie Kingsbury.